Although he is one of the most widely known composers of the 19th century, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky struggled throughout his career with criticism, both from his compatriots and from the musical elite in other Western countries. Colleagues from his own homeland complained that his compositions were not Russian enough, and others lamented the fact that they were too Russian. Critics both then and now have noted that his music often appeals most to a less discerning mass audience due to its emphasis on drama and emotion. One 20th century concertgoer, for example, sees Tchaikovsky's music as, quote, joyful and dramatic, but entirely hollow. In spite of the enduring popularity of many of Tchaikovsky's works, these art music connoisseurs tend to think less of music that relies on, quote, pretty tunes and a grand, swashbuckling impression. Perhaps this is part of why Tchaikovsky's piano cycle, The Seasons, 12 Characteristic Scenes, is largely ignored in many surveys of his life and career. Written around the same time as the much more well-known and important Swan Lake, this set of 12 short pieces understandably tends to be overshadowed and overlooked. The series was commissioned by Nikolai Bernard, publisher of the St. Petersburg journal Nouvelliste, with one piece to be released each month in that publication during 1876. Bernard suggested a title reflecting each characteristic scene he would like to be portrayed, later adding the names of the months as well as corresponding epigraphs for some of the pieces. Tchaikovsky's main motivation for writing The Seasons was monetary. "I am most grateful for your courtesy," he replied to Bernard's commission, "and your readiness to pay me such a high fee." It's apparent from his correspondence during these months that Tchaikovsky did not consider The Seasons his most challenging work. "I continue to bake musical pancakes," he reportedly joked to a friend. "Today I tossed the 10th." January, at the Fireside, was the first composed and submitted for publication in Nouvelliste, and it is very expressive in its depiction of a fire slowly dying out in the hearth. The epigraph chosen by Bernard, an excerpt from a poem by Alexander Pushkin, sets the stage and adds to the imagery. A little corner of peaceful bliss, the night dressed in twilight. The little fire is dying in the fireplace, and the candle has burned out. How does Tchaikovsky create the impression of a flickering fire at the end of its life? He uses dynamic and rhythmic elements, extensive chromaticism and modulation, and a many-layered structure of back and forth, ABA movement. All of these elements combine to create a convincing mood that represents the gradual but discontinuous process of an evening fire dwindling from flame to coals. The overall structure of January is a very distinct A-B-A'-C form. The main motive in the A section is established immediately in the first measure of the piece. It consists of an eighth note and 2/16ths ascending stepwise, followed by 4/8ths. This rhythmic pattern is repeated, sometimes exactly, as in measure 4, and other times as a slight variation, as in the third measure. Although the notes themselves change, the familiar and consistently returning rhythm brings a sense of continuity and comfort appropriate to the fireside setting this piece is intended to evoke. In the B section, a back and forth movement between two repeating rhythmic motives adds to the rising and falling feel of the fire's slow demise. The patterns are set up right at the beginning of this part of the piece and repeated multiple times. The melody here begins on a quarter note at a high point and descends stepwise over 3/8 notes, followed by a half step. This motive alternates with a faster up and down arpeggiation over 16th note triplets, which emphasizes the give and take, advance and retreat feel of a dying fire. The dynamic variation used throughout Tchaikovsky's January also plays a part in creating the image of a fire being gradually extinguished. In the first 4 measures of the piece, for example, the initial piano is followed by a gradual crescendo and almost immediate decrescendo as the phrase ends. The next phrase follows suit, with the variation of increasing to a full forte, which is sustained through 3 measures until a contrasting section begins with the piano again in measure 11. These sometimes gradual and sometimes sudden changes in volume add to the effective portrayal of a fire's unpredictability. The B section of the piece begins with measure-by-measure alternation of dynamics between piano and pianissimo. This fluctuation of sound, together with the oscillating rhythms in these measures, creates an image of slow burning, followed by wisps of ash floating away into the air. Toward the end of this middle section, as the rhythm is transitioning to flowing upward arpeggios, the dynamics move to a steady mezzo forte that is sustained over 9 measures, until a subsection break is signaled by a prolonged rest at the end of measure 45. An even more significant use of silence is found in measure 62, where an entire measure is given over to a prolonged rest. This one signals the end of the contrasting B section and makes the listener pause, perhaps drowsing off in front of the fire, before abruptly returning to the A section once again. These examples show how Tchaikovsky effectively uses both repetition and variation in rhythm and dynamics to create the mood and ambiance of a slowly dying fire. The A section of January begins in the key of A major, but Tchaikovsky is not content to remain in one place for long. To further create the impression of a fire flickering in the hearth, he modulates between keys, as in this change to E major. Most especially, though, he relies on chromaticism to convey the feeling of constant motion, as shown in this excerpt. The B section begins in E minor, but the A sharp that comes and goes over the next several measures doesn't let us feel at home there. In measure 37, we move to A flat major for a short time, to C minor, and then to C major. In the final subsection of B, Tchaikovsky launches into a sequence of arpeggios that act as a chromatic modulation, moving back and forth repeatedly while using a B note as a pedal point in the bass. The section ends with an ascending chromatic scale that ultimately lands on an F sharp, which will be the first note of the returning A section. Tchaikovsky's use of chromatic movement and modulation further develops the impression of flickering flames growing and receding in the hearth. Perhaps the most interesting tool Tchaikovsky employs to create this characteristic scene he wishes to portray is the structure of the piece itself. Both at a macro and a micro level, he uses an ABA or ABAC framework to portray the decline of an evening fire in the hearth by the very design of the music he writes. Of course, a more cynical critic might point out that the amount of repetition in this piece served mainly to speed up its composition, resulting in a more prompt collection of a paycheck. Although this may well have played part in Tchaikovsky's choice to use the cyclical pattern, the result is a piece of music that reflects its meaning through its structure. January at the Fireside is constructed in a clear overall A-B-A'-C format. Each of the main sections can then be broken down into A-B-A', the A section, or A-B-A-C, the B section. Further, each of these subsections contains extensive back and forth movement between motives and phrases, creating what could be seen as a recursive quality of organization, reminiscent of the famous nesting dolls of Tchaikovsky's homeland. One striking example of this nesting within the piece is found in the B section. The first part, identified with a lowercase a, consists of a one major phrase that alternates back and forth multiple times with another phrase, B, and its variation, B'. This entire subsection, A, is then repeated after a modulating subsection, B, with a chromatic subsection, C, acting as coda within the B section as a whole. Thus, the structure of the B section is A-B-A-C, and the underlying framework of each A within that structure is A-B, A-B', A-B, A'. This structure within a structure, together with the melodic, rhythmic, and dynamic features discussed previously, helps create the impression of a fire gradually being extinguished. In spite of the opinions of some critics that Tchaikovsky's work lacks depth and meaning, his music does convey emotion and expression in a way that can guide the imagination of the listener. In the seasons, and particularly in the case of January by the Fireside, a variety of musical elements, including rhythm, dynamics, modulation, and repeated motives, phrases, and sections all work together to create the characteristic scene of a little corner of peaceful bliss. Perhaps this work is not one of his best or most well-known, but it does show how all of these aspects can come together to fulfill the intended purpose of a piece of music.